Hello, everybody. I'm Skip Elsheimer. Welcome to the AV Geeks Lunchtime Streaming Show, where we watch old 16mm films. And today I'm traveling. I'm going to Milwaukee, and so I'll be on a plane when this show is airing. So I decided to pre-record, and we got some films that from my collection that we scanned recently on our scanner, and I'm super excited to share them with you. The first one is a war effort related film called Pulpwood Fights the Japs, and it's basically about how doing forestry work and logging helps the war effort with resources. The second film is The Sound of Sound, which is a film about hearing protection. Then In Time of Trouble, I think this is a film, it's part of the Marriage for Moderns series, which we've shown other films from. This one is, I think it's about alcoholism, maybe? And then finally, it looks like we only have the first reel of this, and I'm actively looking for the second reel, but it's got some beautiful archival footage in it, and it's called Conquest, Man's Flight to Fly. And so it's all this footage of early attempts at air flight. Lots of newsreel footage, assorted things. And I think it's brought to us by Longines, the watch manufacturer. So, enjoy this. Unfortunately, I don't think I'll have Wi-Fi on my plane, so I don't think I'll be able to chime in. But thanks for watching. If you like what you saw, hit the thumbs up, hit the like button. You can donate via the Super Thanks button or ko-fi.com/avgeeks or patreon.com/avgeeks. Those are great ways to support us. Everybody have a great show, and I'm probably going to have to pre-record Wednesday's show. I'm going to pre-record all the shows because I'm going to be at a conference, but I'm going to try to sprinkle it with some interesting visuals of Milwaukee and people in Milwaukee that I know. So, enjoy. Thanks so much, and we will see you soon. Bye.
This is a picture about something our fighting men need today. It's a war material with a high priority, just like B-29s, steel, tanks, ships, shells, and guns. It's something they just must have, and plenty of it. Something that only you folks out there in the audience can give them. That something is pulpwood. Yes, pulpwood. It goes right into battle with those soldiers of ours. Pulpwood, timber from the farm, woodlot, and the forest. Timber from the Lake States, or New England, or the South, or the Appalachian States. The lives of your sons, brothers, and neighbors depend on it. The spruce and balsam, the fir and hemlock and southern pine we know as pulpwood. Their lives depend on it because pulpwood fights with them and protects them, from the powder that fires a Garand rifle to the lining of a tropical helmet, to the paper that safeguards his supplies. Item after item that a GI requires is made of pulpwood. Pulpwood is used in more than 700,000 different war materials and pieces of equipment. But here's the trouble. Right now, we're not getting enough. We need much more pulpwood to supply our men with what they'll need to get this war over with. It's a serious situation. This war's moving faster and faster every minute. We're dropping more and more bombs, for instance. The rings that protect those bombs in shipment are made of pulpwood. We're firing more and bigger ammunition at the enemy. The powder that sends off 105mm shells and 16-inch naval shells is made of pulpwood. Now that the war in the Pacific has been stepped up so much, we have to send supplies to more and more soldiers in tropical battle areas and over greater distances. Long, long hauls. Those supplies are not only packaged in materials made of pulpwood, but double packaged for protection against heat and insects. More and more wounded require surgical dressings and blood plasma. Without the protection of pulpwood packaging, double packaging, that blood plasma, those medical supplies, never could get safely to the dressing stations. Yes, as more and more men go into action, as the battle in the Pacific gets tougher, the need for pulpwood becomes ever greater. More and more pulpwood must be cut by the regular lumberjacks and loggers who even now are working from dawn to dusk. And because more than they can produce is needed, our government and our fighting men look to farmers to make up the shortage. Unless the American farmer, the agricultural worker, and the logger get out into the forest and woodlots and start cutting extra cords, the shortage is going to get so serious that it will affect the entire war effort. Of course, Uncle Sam knows the farmer's a busy man these days. But he knows, too, that there are certain times, certain seasons when farmers don't have to be out in the fields. At these times, Uncle Sam asks that you cut pulpwood. Here's the story in black and white. Last year, the War Production Board asked for 14 million cords, but got well over 15 million as a result of farmer help, backed up by excellent work on the part of foresters, county agents, and local newspaper editors. This year, they asked for 16 million, and at the moment, we're far behind that figure. At the rate we're cutting, we're going to stay behind unless farmers do even more than last year. Here's where those 16 million cords are supposed to go. Here's why they've just got to be cut. 10,700,000 cords are needed immediately by the armed forces for powder and shells and shell casings and hospital supplies and the millions of tons of paper used for military packaging and boxes, for military maps and papers of every kind. The need for V-boxes alone is now 42 million every month. Over 1 million a day are shipped overseas. The rest of the 16 million cords, about a third of it, goes for essential civilian uses. Farmers need plenty of it themselves. For instance, after it's processed in mills and factories, pulpwood comes back to the farm in the form of bags for fertilizer, animal and poultry feeds. Such bags are made of pulpwood. Pulpwood will come back to you from factory and mill in the form of containers for milk, corrugated and fiber shipping cases, cartons for eggs. After the wood's been changed into pulp, it'll become paper to wrap up the nation's meat order, paper to package seed, and when peace comes, you're going to need plenty of processed pulpwood like this for such things as building and sheathing papers, chicken brooders, or any one of hundreds of other items. And they're all made of pulp like this, pulp that comes from the wood you cut. So when you answer your country's call and get out into the forest and farm woodlot with an axe and a saw, you're not only helping the military effort, you're helping yourselves. You're helping yourselves in many ways. Every stick of pulpwood that goes to the mill is cash in your pocket. Prices for pulpwood today are peak prices. Trees are a real cash crop. On many a farm, there's $1,000 worth or more of them. And hundreds of America's farmers are cutting theirs now while prices are at peak. Mills paid $80 million for farm-produced pulpwood last year. And when you cut pulpwood, you're getting into a big new industry with a big post-war future. Yes, if you thin out your woodlands properly now, cutting selectively according to recommended forestry standards so that you maintain a healthy stand of timber, you'll have a head start in the production of plastics and all the wonderful materials that will be made from pulpwood in the peace years to come. So for patriotism, yes, and for personal profit, too, get those trees of yours on their way to the mill. Nobody's too old, nobody's too young. Cutting pulpwood is so essential, the need for it is so urgent, that Selective Service draft boards take it into consideration when deferments are requested. Pulpwood cutters may even apply to their local ration board or County War Board for extra gasoline, tires, and trucks. Yes, your government and the men in the fighting services look to you who have timber on your land, or who live near timber, or who regularly cut pulpwood, to help relieve the present serious pulpwood shortage. If you have never cut pulpwood before, or if there's anything special you want to know about prices, specifications, selective cutting, or anything else, see your county agent or forester or mill buyer or your local editor. And get to work now. Get those trees on your land into the war. Just think, a single cord of wood from your farm will make 2,140 shell containers. A single cord will make enough military maps to stage a major invasion, weatherproof maps to be used in the invasion of Japan. A single cord will make 800 wadded aviation vests for high-altitude flying. A single cord can save the lives of 4,200 wounded men, some of them boys you know maybe, by getting medical supplies safely to where they're needed. A single cord from trees that you cut will provide 90,000 rounds of smokeless powder for a Garand rifle. It will fire 420 big shells like this, or 24 like this. Yes, on the sea and in the air and on the land, the pulpwood that has already been cut in the forests and on farm woodlots is fighting the Japs. Aiding our own boys, but we haven't got enough. We need more, and we need it badly. For the sake of those who are already doing so much in this war, from now on, will you give every moment that you can to the cutting of pulpwood and help bring those boys of ours safely back, soon and victorious?
It's 18 minutes before the hour, and you've got 1150 on your dial. The place for all the good sounds of summer.
Hey, gee, there's a good place. Gee, I'm tired. When are we gonna eat?
What is sound?
Sound to me is anything I can hear with my ears.
Sound is something that's heard, something that's received by the ear.
Sound to me now is anything that can be heard by the ear.
Actually, without sound, you wouldn't really know what was going on.
Sound are all the things you hear around you.
What does sound mean to you? Sound is a way of seeing with your ears. We're surrounded by sound, and we never really think about it. The sounds of life. Ever think what it would be like if they weren't there? What is sound?
What is sound? Noise.
The sound is noise as far as I'm concerned. Noise.
Noise can leave your ears ringing. And if a few seconds of noise can do this, think what 8 hours a day of it will do. Or 5 days a week. Or 12 months a year. Sound can hurt. And when it causes you pain, you've got to figure that it's not doing your ears any good. So you try and get away from it. Or stop it. Or if neither is possible, you find a way to protect your ears against it. If you don't, you're going to have a problem. But sound doesn't have to be painful to damage your ears. It just has to be loud. Any time or any place it becomes difficult to talk. When you have to speak louder than normal, or when you have to shout to be heard, your ears are taking a beating!
Loud noises or loud sound would bother me after the damn thing occurs, and you still have it in your head, like working on light gauge steel. You work on it all day, then you go home and you got that hum in your head, that buzz in your head.
I get a ringing sensation. Sometimes I get a buzzing. My wife tried to talk to me. I have to tell her to raise her voice up because I can't hear for an hour or two.
Sound bothers me pretty bad, I'll tell you. When I get home at times, I get irrational. I don't know, just nervous, things like that, you know?
You still hear a part of your noise. It's a hissing sound, and you have to turn the television up louder, radio up louder. You don't hear your wife or your children. It's always what you say, what you say, what you say.
And it takes maybe 2 to 3 hours for your ears to get back to where, normal.
But I mean, you're still uptight because I don't know, this noise or something has a tendency to follow you for a while.
I mean, it really gets to you. Just like a steady hum, or a steady buzz of the noise. And just really gets to you.
But when you ask some people if noise bothers them, they'll tell you...
Well, not now, no, not after 15 years.
And when you ask them why, they'll say...
I become accustomed to it.
But they don't become accustomed to it. They're going deaf. Ask their families.
He drives up the driveway. If you could hear the radio when he drives up the driveway in the car. This is when the windows are closed. I know he's coming. And my boy has a pretty strong voice. And he'll say, Dad, how about that baseball game? The so-and-so pitched. Wasn't that terrific or something? And my husband doesn't even know that he even said it sometimes. Quite a few times he'd be sitting in the yard. Neighbors would walk through and say hi to him, and he wouldn't answer. And they'd say to me, doesn't he want to speak? And I'd say, no, just excuse him. He doesn't hear you.
A hearing loss caused by this kind of sound is a little like getting a sunburn. It's a matter of exposure. Imagine it's your first day at the beach and the sun feels great. Not too hot because there's a good breeze. So you stay out all day without a shirt. What happens? You get burned and you never felt it coming. A sound burn takes a lot longer, possibly years, but it creeps up on you the same way. There's just one difference. A sunburn will heal up. Hearing damage won't. Let's see what it looks like from inside the ear. There are three major sections in the ear: the outer, middle, and inner. It's in the inner ear that the most important part of our hearing mechanism is located. As sound comes in, these little hair-like nerve cells begin to vibrate. And when you bombard them 8 hours a day with noise, they get tired, and it takes a while for them to bounce back. They're a little like grass. You step on it, and it bounces back. But the more you step on it and beat it down, the longer it takes to come back. Until one day, it doesn't. And when those little nerve cells in your inner ear lie down, you've got hearing problems.
Quite a few times now, we have a park right around where I live at. And my wife and the kids like to walk through there. And times she'll say to me, well, did you hear that bird? Isn't that a nice sounding bird and whatnot? And I'd say, no, I can't even hear it. What does it sound like? Does it sound like a woodpecker? Or does it sound like a blue jay? What does it sound like? I can't hear it.
I can't hear the high-pitched notes, such as ringing in the phone.
You miss the birds, you miss all the high-pitched sounds. These sounds here you miss now. You know you heard them before. But really, to get the sound from these things now, you have to see it.
Take the sound out of sound. It's like taking the color out of sight.
Well, I notice on some conversations that where the people are talking real quiet, I notice that I don't catch on right away unless I'm real close to them.
In general conversation with some individuals, I think they're talking too soft, and it may be true, and it may not be. But I do find myself asking them to repeat themselves. I hear them, but it's muffled. It's not quite clear.
Well, today the only thing I miss is TV sound, that's all. If I turn it up real loud, then nobody else could stay in the same room.
If someone tells a joke, you miss the point of it. Well, every day if the child or my wife don't look right at me when they're speaking, why I don't pick up the complete conversation.
The telephone, I had trouble on the telephone, especially with women's voices.
Sometimes I don't even hear people in the living room sitting amongst them. Look, can't hear a conversation properly. Very unpleasant to say, what'd you say? Pardon me, huh?
I can't hear.
You know he's talking, but what is he saying?
What?
Questions are asked, but not understood. Your friends try for a while, then they quit trying.
Well, it kind of puts you away from the outside world in a way, really. It kind of leaves you out by yourself there.
Getting the words like hearing television and stuff like that or in conversation, well, I'm out.
I feel lost, Bob. I feel like I'm out as well. I'm in a place by myself. There's people around me, but I see them. I don't hear them.
And when it gets worse, and it will if you keep exposing your ears to a noise beating, the good sounds of life will go. So what do you do to protect your hearing?
One thing, they've come out recently with these hearing, we call them earmuffs. And I think they're, in a sense, they're good. They're not going to bring back my hearing, but what hearing I do have, I think they're going to protect.
I think these muffs really help me out considerably.
Before they brought the ear protection to the yard, and this is the God's truth, I used to go home with buzzing in my head, humming because of your blowers they have in the yard. But then they came around these earmuffs, and we start wearing them. I go home now, and this is the gospel truth. I go home now, the humming is not there anymore.
I find using them when as much as I possibly can, it helps to eliminate some of that problem in the end of the day.
Most of my men have to wear them. It's a compulsory thing. They've lost most of their hearing, but this is to protect whatever they have left for them, that's all. But it's the greatest thing that ever happened for especially people using pneumatic hammers.
At one time in here, we used to have cotton balls, you know, and put them inside of our ears, until I found out that they were dangerous by my doctor. And I'm sure glad these earmuffs come out.
Well, I would think that a new guy coming in should start right away with some hearing protection, and he probably would never get in the condition that I've been in, because I've worked for quite a number of years without it, and his mind is really impaired.
Well, there's two things that I respect, my hearing and my eyesight. And anybody that comes in a noisy industry like we got here, I think they're foolish if they don't protect both of them.
But how are you going to hear people talk if you have hearing protection on?
I can hear a person speak, but it muffles your machine noise.
And voices sound like this.
To get those diameters in there right. When I put the cutter back on, bring it as close as possible.
Protection. On the job, on the field. It's a big part of our lives. Hearing protection, part of an ongoing effort to improve your working conditions and to protect you. Think about what you hear, or don't hear. The sound of sound. What is it worth to you? Think about it. Think about saving it.
Drank before this December. Even before we were married, when he was in the army, and his friends got drunk every Saturday night. John only took an occasional drink.
How do you know that, Mrs. Dankman?
John wouldn't lie to me, I'm sure of that. No matter what else he's done, he'd never try to fool me.
Well, that's very important.
I couldn't put up with a liar. I can take a lot, and I have taken a lot, but that's one thing I wouldn't take.
Well, since drinking isn't an old habit with him, you say you just noticed it about 6 months ago. What do you think is behind it?
These things are beyond me. I don't know. My mother used to say, drinking is a bad streak in someone's character. I know that's not true. People don't suddenly develop streaks. This is something much deeper. I don't know what to do about it. That's why I came to you. I'm at the end of my rope. In every other crisis, I've been able to figure things out. I've tried to be a good wife in spite of everything, but now I just don't know what to do.
Well, coming to me was a very good thing to do.
For Dr. Burns doesn't believe his function as a minister ends when the marriage ceremony is over. He feels that leading divine service and preaching must be combined with his continuing availability as a counselor, as a trusted leader of his congregation.
Talking this sort of thing over with another person always helps.
But I don't need help. John does. We have to figure out some way to help him. Maybe some modern drug or Alcoholics Anonymous or something.
I don't think such drastic measures are in order, at least not from what you've told me.
Perhaps you'd speak to him. He might listen to you.
Maybe. But first I'd like to know more about the problem. I'd like to talk it over with you, fully, in detail. Do you think we could do that?
Well, yes, of course, but that's what we've been doing, isn't it? I've told you everything.
Almost, but I'd still like to know a little bit more. Such as what these things are that you have to put up with. What life with John is like, for you. For instance, what happened last Sunday, the day he drank too much? What happened earlier in the day? Do you remember by any chance?
Well, let me think. We were just sitting around the living room that afternoon after dinner. I like to think of Sunday as a day of rest. Of course, I was doing a little mending, and John was listening to a football broadcast. Jane was there with us, busy as a little beaver with her toys. At that point, the radio seemed a little noisy, so I asked John to turn down the volume a bit. All I meant was that we could do with a little less shouting. It's so wearing on the nerves, you know, especially a child's. But John seemed to think I was asking something unreasonable, so he turned the game off completely in a fit of temper. Well, I thanked him, of course, but I couldn't help being amused by his childish behavior. Then later, when I had to prepare supper for Jane, I asked John to look after the child for a few minutes. His idea of looking after a child was to dance her around the living room like a maniac, getting her all excited and overheated. Imagine, just before supper. And he was actually insulted when I took her away to try and calm her down a bit. Then after supper, I was washing the dishes, alone because I hate men messing around the kitchen. When he suddenly began shouting for me, I just couldn't imagine what was wrong. A classmate of his had been married. Think of that. When I told him he would wake the baby and that really I couldn't even remember the man he was talking about, he started pouting again. Later that evening, the Phillips called. They wanted us to come over and see them. John was eager to go, of course. Made no difference to him. I had all the month's accounts to go over. He was the one who's always talking about spending too much, yet all he ever seemed to think of was his own pleasure. I think he doesn't really know what to do with himself on a day off. Finally, in desperation that Sunday, he decided to go for a walk. He came in around 11:30. I heard him stumbling around downstairs, knocking into things. So I got up. The noises he made as he came upstairs was enough to wake an elephant. He was definitely tipsy. He didn't know what he was doing. As he tried to kiss me, I could actually smell the whiskey on his breath. It was terrible. John, whom I really love,
I was angry. And frightened. Just telling you about it makes me so ashamed that I could...
I understand, Mrs. Denkman. I know it isn't easy to talk about. I know how you feel, and I'm really sorry about it. But it isn't tragic yet. It could get to be. That is, if we don't do something to stop it.
That's just it. That's why I came to you.
You and I both working together, I'm sure we can do something. You know, you are really a good wife, Mrs. Denkman. And I think basically John is a fine person. Let me think about it for a few days. Work out a plan of action. And we'll talk some more, say Friday about this time. And meanwhile, don't discuss the matter with John.
Dr. Burns spent quite a bit of time thinking about the problem. He'd married the Denkmans, knew them both well, especially John, who'd grown up in the neighborhood. Nice, steady boy, never what you'd call a drinker. He could ask him to come in, but that didn't seem the right thing to do. Not now. Dr. Burns knew Mrs. Denkman, too. She was quite active in the church sisterhood. Sometimes the ladies found her a little too active, especially when she offered to help them. She had a habit of wanting things her way, a strong habit. Dr. Burns and the others had come to realize she didn't mean to be unpleasant. She simply had that kind of personality. And he didn't think he could or should try to change it now. She probably wasn't very easy to live with, but she was a smart young woman and a capable one. And she would do anything she could to make her marriage work, now that trouble was looming. If he could only find a way to help her channel that eagerness for her own good.
Well, your faith in me is very gratifying, but I'm afraid it's not quite as easy as that. Not that I haven't been thinking about it, and I do have some ideas, but, well, maybe you can help me.
Me?
Yes, you. After all, you know much more about John than I do.
But I've already told you everything.
Day, you said you had the feeling that there was some reason behind the drinking.
I read somewhere that...
I believe that's right. They don't like the way they feel, so they try to numb their feelings with alcohol.
But why would John want to do that?
I don't know. And if I asked him, he might not know. But I've been wondering if maybe you knew something that might give us a clue. Does he love you?
I think he does. He says he does.
And how about Jane? How does he feel about her?
Oh, he loves her, of course.
What about married life? Does he feel about it as you do?
I don't know. I don't really think so. He lets me handle all the problems. He's a carefree kind of person.
Maybe that's the answer. Get him more interested in the marriage. Give him some of the problems to solve. Let him share in those and in the pleasures, too.
I don't think I understand you.
Well, when you were telling me about your home life the other day, I got a picture of a man who was sort of out of things. For instance, you said that John annoyed you when he interrupted you while you were doing the dishes. And that's natural when you've got an awful lot to do. But from what you tell me, he feels lonely when you're so busy. That's not unnatural either, is it? After all, companionship is one of the most important things that married people can give each other. I think it might be a good idea if you turned over all those annoying accounts to him.
But I only take care of those things so John won't have to worry about them.
I know. You're very considerate. Too considerate, maybe.
I don't understand.
I only mean that by doing everything yourself, by taking everything into your own capable hands, you don't leave much for John to do. Maybe if you changed a bit, worried less, took things easier, you might be helping John.
Helping him?
Certainly. Helping him get more involved in the marriage. In you. In Jane. You want to help him, don't you?
Well, of course I do, but
This may be the best way to do it. As a matter of fact, I'm almost sure it is. The least we can do is to try. After all, it's about time you started to get some pleasure out of family life. If it's all chores, you won't like it forever either. It's time you started to have some fun. Now, what can you think of doing? Just for instance.
Well, I suppose we might have people to the house more often, like we used to. John likes company, and he's kind of fun when he's entertaining. I enjoy a party myself. And then there's Jane. I guess I could try letting him help with her once in a while. Of course, he's never very good at that sort of thing. All the fuss he makes over her. It might be hard on the child at first, but I'd be right there in case he got into trouble. You know, maybe he could learn in time and take some of the work off my hands.
That's exactly the sort of thing I mean. And I suspect you're going to be amazed at how good John is at being a husband. So he may complain a bit from time to time, but I think you'll really like it. Right?
He won't want to escape. Oh, thank you, Dr. Burns. I knew you'd help. I think I feel better about it already. I want my marriage to succeed. I believe in marriage sincerely. And I love John, really I do.
I know you do.
You must help him.
I'll do my best to help both of you.
Oh, thank you.
Would it work? Not forever, Dr. Burns guessed. But now, weeks later, the Dinkmans still show outward signs of getting along together fairly well. The temporary patching seems to be effective. Dr. Burns thinks that next time Mrs. Dinkman comes to him for help, she may be more able to face the real problem, her own personality. Until she's ready to see the part that it is playing in her marriage, he can do little to resolve the basic trouble in the relationship. But like all family counselors, the minister knows that time is on the side of the better understanding of interpersonal problems. At least he's given time a chance, and he'll be here, ready to help, when the right time comes.
You have just seen represent the opening and closing chapters of an era. The sinking of the United States armored battleship Maine in Havana, Cuba, 1898. And the free passage of a supersonic rocket at the White Sands, New Mexico Proving Grounds, 1955. This is Conquest.
The Longines Whitnor Watch Company presents Conquest. Edition 1, Man's Fight to Fly. The Longines
This is Westbrook Van Voris. We live in an incredible era. Our creative energies have taken us into the realm of the fantastic. Our world is one in which man's feeble personal vision has been extended to girdle the globe. Man tracks and can destroy rockets, warships, and airplanes he has never seen. He lives on a dying planet and yet has unlocked the supreme key to the storehouse of energy which will sustain him for eons. But it was not always thus. For some mysterious reason, man has moved further and faster in the last half-century than in all the time that went before. Historians are not yet far enough removed to tell us why this is so. But we do know that these 50 years represent not only a tremendous technological change, but a change in our minds and our habits as well. We have experienced 2 world wars, 2 depressions, 2 great prosperities, and we have learned. This, then, is the unique story of how our social and economic pressures have cast their well-defined shadows upon the machines that share this world we inhabit. This is the story of progress.
Voices of the comedians.
It brought gold in the Klondike, the automobile of a whiskered plainsman by the name of Buffalo Bill, the Diamond Jubilee of Queen Victoria.
And man had dreamed of flight. He had crossed the sands and the mountains and had sailed the seas. But still he looked longingly at the graceful and delicate soaring of the birds high above his head. As early as memory can recollect, man tried it. These early motion pictures show Franz Reichelt, who by draping his arms with wings of cloth, proposed to jump 350 feet from the first level of the Eiffel Tower and glide gracefully to Earth. But even though flight in a heavier-than-air machine had not yet been successfully demonstrated, gas balloons and later the rigid airship were practical realities. This contrivance was controlled by the rapid pedaling of the operator and maneuvered by a tail and steering assembly, in principle the same as that used on our most modern jet aircraft.
But the clock had been wound, and time was moving at a quickened pace. President McKinley had been assassinated at the huge Buffalo Pan American Exposition. Victor Herbert's famous score, written to celebrate that same fair, was being played in the music halls, and the most popular songwriter of the day was Harry von Tilser, whose Down Where the Cotton Blossoms Grow, Down Where the Würzburger Flows, and Goodbye, Eliza Jane, were the rage of the barbershop quartets on every main street. The new president, Teddy Roosevelt of Rough Rider fame, sent a message to Governor Taft in the Philippines via the remarkable new Trans-Pacific Telegraph cable. And Dr. H. Nelson Jackson and Sewell Crocker made the first successful motor crossing of the United States, leaving San Francisco on the 23rd of May and arriving in New York 64 days later.
But it remained for Orville and Wilbur Wright, two bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, to realize the great dream of the air. The story of their first flight on the cold, blustery morning of December 17th, 1903, at Kitty Hawk, South Carolina, has been told and retold in history books the world over. These pictures are actual photographs of their fragile airplane. But what is most interesting is the fact that a Professor Samuel P. Langley had conducted a series of government-sponsored tests at the same time in Washington, D.C. And although a steam-driven model had actually flown, the full-scale prototype ended in failure. The press had paid great attention to the Langley trials, and when the second flying attempt ended in disaster, the skeptics smiled, and the world at large felt secure behind the fact that man was not destined to streak across the sky. The Wrights had flown. The first flight lasted 12 seconds and covered a distance of about 120 feet. And then, as if in retribution for having trod upon forbidden territory, the light plane was caught in the cold palm of the wind and overturned. But strangest of all was that the world would not believe. The newspapers had reported the failure of the Langley tests in great detail only 9 days earlier, and now refused to believe the Wrights' claim of success. How feeble that first flight seems today, barely 50 years later. For the ground distance covered that historic morning at Kitty Hawk, South Carolina, was less than the wingspan of modern military aircraft.
Mr. Edison's iridescent little electric bulb was transforming Broadway into the street of a million lights. George M. Cohan and his beautiful leading lady, Faye Templeton, were charming audiences in the ever-popular 45 Minutes from Broadway. Jack London's Call of the Wild stirred many a heart. Boston defeated Pittsburgh 5-3 to take the World Series. And Enrico Caruso made his debut at the Metropolitan Opera. It would seem as if this were indeed a great moment in our national lives. Art and the theater flourished, and the names of the famous of that day are still on our lips. Charming, sylph-like Nellie Melba. The inimitable, divine Sarah Bernhardt.
108. And while the Japanese were in the process of establishing a dictatorship over Korea, the spotlight swung to the continent, where a young French aviator and mechanic, Louis Blériot, piloted an airplane of his own design over 25 miles of heaving water to win the London Daily Mail prize of £1,000 and become the first man ever to fly the English Channel. Much of this rare film has been destroyed through fire, accident, and decay. But there is no doubt that the motion picture camera has provided us with the living history, which is the prologue to future miracles.
Glenn L. Martin established a factory for the manufacture of airplanes at Santa Ana, California, but airplane construction was hardly big business. And so he supplemented his income by stunt flying for another infant industry, the movies. Even the balloon provided just another useful situation for the fertile minds of the silent screen comedians. The petite gentleman in the foreground is the first great impresario artist of film, D.W. Griffith. The start may have been slow, but the pace is quickening, and the air age is upon us. The people are now looking toward the sky, and we can see the beginning of a new kind of outdoor circus adventurer, the barnstormer, complete with entertainment and all.
The world was uneasy, and its persons of power like Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany met and posed stiffly with staff and advisors. But underneath the pomp and formality ran a deep and troubling undercurrent, which was felt by all. For like some giant pendulum, the world was moving closer and closer to the most gigantic struggle it had ever seen. And the military, conservative though they were forced to recognize the potential of the machine which flew. Practical experiments were conducted in dive bombing. Aerial bombs intended to be dropped by hand and sighted by eye were designed and manufactured. The distant rumble of battle drums from across the water was heard by only a few. But the seriousness with which the Army viewed the situation can be measured by the size of their first appropriation for air, $125,000. And that same year listed in its annals the first graduate Army pilot, a young man by the name of Lieutenant Hap Arnold.
March 18, 1913.
King George of Greece assassinated.
June 28, 1914.
Archduke Ferdinand of Austria is assassinated. And July 28, 1914, 4 weeks to the day later, the war to save democracy is on. No one country entered the war with more than 1,200 airplanes. France led with 1,100 trained pilots. And in 1914, the United States lagged far behind, not even equaling the failing strength of Imperial Russia, with barely 240 pilots and only 100 planes.
But still, America, protected by 3,000 miles of ocean, watched and waited, but did not act. There was a new kind of dance called the foxtrot, and a new kind of fast-moving humor, championed by two zany, side-splitting vaudeville stars, Mr. Gallagher and Mr. Sheehan.
The weeks moved on into months, and the months gathered into years. and the war in Europe shifted into high gear. It might be said that the war brought aviation out of its infancy stage and threw it to fend for itself into the midst of the fray. For by 1915, the flying machine was no longer merely a scientific curiosity. Reckless barnstorming had been the prelude to reckless fighting, and the air war already had its personal aces. Lieutenant Max Immelman, the Eagle of Lille. His first combat experience came after only one instruction period. And before he was killed, he had won 17 spectacular victories. The Red Knight of Germany, Baron Manfred von Richthofen, first German ace, leader of the famed flying circus. He developed and perfected formation flying, was credited with 80 official victories before he too was shot down in August 1918. For the world was on fire, and it burned as it had never burned before. Pancho Villa and his bandit army ran riot in the southwest. And Russia, already reeling under the bloody blows from without, lay torn by revolution. And
on April 6, 1917, the United States, provoked by acts of international aggression, declared war on Germany. 1 million young men from every walk of life waited for their numbers to be pulled from a glass fishbowl to answer the call to arms. The nation stood united and determined, and 10 weeks later, the first American troops were in France.
Chapter 1 is closed. Chapter 2 begins.
By the end of January, American troops were on the front lines. The Great War was on, and these scenes are remembered today vividly by the millions who lived them. Unfamiliar names became a permanent part of our language and our hearts. Chateau Thierry, Belleau Woods, Verdun. On the home front, the women pitched in to get the job done. They ran the post office department, directed traffic, drove taxi cabs, and worked in the huge, hurriedly built aircraft factories. For in this war, the airplane was to emerge the victor. In less than a year, the United States performed a mighty industrial miracle.
$750 million was appropriated for air, and the ranks of the Corps were expanded to 100,000 men and officers. The famous Liberty engine was designed by a team of crack engineers in a Washington hotel room in 4 days. And before the year was out, we had built almost 14,000 of them. Equipped with new planes and courage, the American aviators in France took to the air. Major William Mitchell became the first American officer to fly across enemy lines, and the men who followed covered themselves with glory. These early pictures show America's ace of aces, Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, whose famous hat and ring squadron became a symbol of freedom for which America fought. The story of aviation during the war years was, more than ever, the story of the people who had the faith and the gift of genius to fly, maneuver, and fight in this primitive equipment. The gentle rhythm of the universe ticked on, paying no heed to the bruises at Flanders, or the long, somber columns of smoke which hung in the air. And after our year of fighting...
Armistice Day, November 11, 1918.
After the waiting, the hardship, the effort, the tragedy, the war was over. President Wilson went to France. The peace talks were on. The boys came home.
The war was over, and 10,000 trained pilots were released to civilian duties. Planes and the men to fly them were in abundance. And so the government, under President Wilson, inaugurated the first regular airmail service, Washington to New York. Air travel was here to stay, and the first passenger line set up a commercial schedule between New York and, yes, you guessed it, Atlantic City, New Jersey.
Post-war period, the roaring 20s, the 30s were filled with great achievement. As early as 1919, the British dirigible R-34 made a successful crossing of the Atlantic. People flew higher and faster and longer.
At sea, the Navy, recognizing the tremendous potential of its newly discovered air power, launched the first carrier, the USS Langley, and proceeded to develop the dive bombing tests, which formed the core of so many air battles of the Second World War. Using captured German destroyers, dive, attack, and torpedo techniques were studied. But this mastery did not come without a price. The first carrier landings were difficult. The planes were light, and the last-minute swirl of the air currents or the swell of the sea caused many a mishap.
Brought a dramatic release from the tensions of conflict and war. The nation relaxed. In Washington, Calvin Coolidge occupied the White House. And with Mr. Coolidge came a return to normalcy. The best-selling book was F. Scott Fitzgerald's This Side of Paradise. And in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, another group of Americans plotted all day to keep their fellow Americans up all night.
Here are the incomplete returns again. Harding, 391 electro votes. Cox, 127. Harding, 391. Cox, 127. Now, before we leave you, I'd like to ask those who heard this election broadcast to communicate with us, telling us how it was received. We're anxious to know how far this broadcast was received. Write your card or letter to station KDKA, East Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Prohibition became the law of the land, and the bartenders and their customers moved one flight down to the cellar. And America rushed forward. The unknown soldier was entombed in Washington. A great disarmament conference was held, and prosperity boomed higher and higher. The buildings went up and up, and so did the stock market. People were married underwater, and orchestras played in the sky.
One of the most amazing incidents of this fabulous era concerned a tall, slight American boy of 25, an airmail pilot from St. Louis. The idea of flying non-stop from New York to Paris, France, had long fascinated men of the air. And early in 1927, spurred on by a $25,000 prize, the young man from St. Louis gunned his motor and sent his small silver monoplane bumping over the runway at Roosevelt Field and into the sky over the empty ocean. His courageous flight immediately captured the hearts of people on both sides of the Atlantic. Radio alerts were sent, asking ships to keep the watch, and hourly broadcasts told the waiting millions at home of the progress. 33½ hours and 400 gallons of gasoline later, the Spirit of St. Louis settled gracefully from the sky at Le Bourget Airfield in France. And Lucky Lindy, the lone eagle, became the hero of the day, the hour, and the year.
New York had learned how to celebrate, and parades were the order of the day. The great metropolis gave Lindy the biggest, most lavish parade it had ever given anyone before, or would give in the years to come. Take a good look. There's never been another one like it. The second era was drawing to a close, but no one cared to notice. This was a fantastic decade. The immortal Babe Ruth had signed a $70,000 a year contract with the Yankees. And Rudolph Valentino, the idol of the silent screen, was dead. The year, 1929, and everything flew high, for there seemed to be no limit.
October 28th, Monday, and the market fell. For 3 days, the struggle went on, and then came complete collapse, economic chaos, and the beginning of a world crisis. Slowly, a creeping paralysis took hold and settled in the factories and in the mills, and the nation slowed down. We were too busy at home to see what was happening across the ocean, even though the airplane had shortened that gulf to a matter of hours. For in Europe, strong power had taken over at the first sign of economic unrest. And while our veterans of the First World War stood on the street corners selling apples, 107 Nazis who were to help formulate the Second World War were elected to the Reichstag.
In Chicago, August Picard demonstrated a stratosphere balloon flight with ordinary toy balloons. And judging by the results, the experiment is not to be recommended. The years move slowly now, and the nation, in the depth of its greatest depression, chose as its new leader a man with an indomitable smile, a charming personality, and a tremendous capacity for work, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
During the dark 30s, the aviation transport business suffered heavily, as did most commercial enterprises. But government mail subsidies kept the schedules mainly intact and held the backbone of the young industry together. Speed and distant records were made in earnest now, with equipment that even today looks modern. But in addition to the publicity-seeking record makers, there emerged a new generation of commercial pioneers. New and better air lanes were charted and explored. Regular clipper service began between San Francisco and Honolulu, and the mails flew the Pacific via stopovers at islands whose names were to become familiar to every American: Midway, Wake, Guam. Instrument flying became standard, and air travel joined the rails and roads as a common carrier.
But, as with all great pioneering efforts, conquest of the air and the growth of the huge industry was not accomplished without heartbreak and tragedy. That's the unforgettable Will Rogers, whose special brand of American straightforward humor helped us laugh at ourselves during the darkest moments of the Depression. He and his close friend, the 36-year-old aviator Wiley Post of round-the-world fame, were killed when their plane crashed August 15th in the fog near Point Barrow, Alaska. Amelia Earhart, who had been the first woman to cross the Atlantic, first woman to cross the continent, and first woman to fly nonstop from Mexico City to New York, was lost in the Pacific while finishing the last leg of a round-the-world flight.
While Americans did not spare the time to observe, great political upheavals were taking place in Europe. But they could not ignore the revolution taking place over their heads, for the age of the giant dirigible was upon us. There have always been two schools of thought regarding air travel. Those who flew the fast, but small, heavier-than aircraft, and those who built larger, gas-filled balloons or zeppelins, as the new deluxe German airships were called. Experiments were undertaken to develop new and uniquely different uses of air and craft. And the United States, in possession of the super airship Macon, carried on extensive study. Here is the still familiar voice of the late Graham McNamee, as he describes early films of the historic Macon.
Son's own brood, and he wants to be picked up. Quickly, the orders flash by phone, and the plane slowly nestles up to the body of the big mothership, ready to be gathered in. And here he goes. Watch it. There. The plane's hooked on and can now be drawn up into the airship and stored. It's one of the marvels of modern naval aviation. It makes the Macon one of the most dangerous warships in the world, a veritable flying hornet's nest.
The Zeppelins were monstrous in size, slow of speed, and relatively unmaneuverable. The United States herself had several fateful experiences with the unwieldy craft. The Macon plunged into the Pacific shortly after the pictures you saw a moment ago were made. The Shenandoah, caught in a line squall, broke in two over Ohio. And the Akron crashed into the Atlantic during a violent thunderstorm and was destroyed.